Victorian London has a particular way of settling over the imagination, like a velvet curtain lowered slowly at dusk. The streets dim beneath gas lamps, the fog thickens into something almost theatrical, and the whole city seems to exhale in long, tired breaths. It's the perfect setting to imagine a very rare creature indeed, a millionaire. A figure so unusual in the 19th century that most people would never see one outside of a caricature, a newspaper column, or perhaps a passing glimpse of a grand carriage disappearing into the mist. Tonight, we're going to drift into that world, quietly, gently, as though slipping through a long hallway lined with portraits that follow you with their eyes. This isn't the frantic version of history where everything explodes or collapses. No, this is the slower, softer, more atmospheric tour, the kind meant for evenings when the mind wants something rich but calm, something you can sink into while the outside world fades to a low hum. Before we stepped inside those tall oak doors and brushed past the butler who has absolutely perfected the art of silent judgment, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your thoughts loosen a little. You're settling in with Boring Owl, where history wanders at its own unhurried pace and the stories stretch out long enough for the day's noise to settle into the background. Think of it like an old, warm book you don't have to hold up, one that narrates itself while you simply listen. Now, being a millionaire in Victorian times wasn't just a matter of having money. It was practically a lifestyle class of its own, part theater, part pressure cooker, part elaborate social chess match. Wealth in this era wasn't quiet. It was heavy. It creaked in the floorboards, shimmered in the oil paintings, and spoke in the rustle of silk skirts sweeping past marble staircases. It demanded constant maintenance, endless rituals, and the sort of polished composure that could make even a statue feel underdressed. But it also meant living in a world built to cushion you from nearly every inconvenience. Meals appeared without asking. Fires were lit before you entered the room. Letters were written, delivered, sorted, and responded to without your hand ever leaving your pocket. Whole teams of people existed solely to ensure that you moved through life as effortlessly as a ship cutting across still water. Still, beneath all that polish, there was a strange kind of tension. An awareness that reputation was fragile, fortunes could wobble, and society could turn cold faster than a London fog. Victorian millionaires lived in a constant dance between luxury and anxiety, privilege and performance, indulgence and expectation. Over the next chapters, we'll wander gently through that world, room by room, ritual by ritual, following the footsteps of the wealthy as they navigate mornings filled with polished silver, evenings drenched in candlelight, and days stitched together by etiquette, status, and the occasional dramatic flourish. And we'll do it all at an easy, unhurried pace, letting the story drift as if we're watching the city through a slowly passing carriage window. So, let's begin our quiet journey into the life of a Victorian millionaire, where wealth was enormous, appearances were everything, and the nights were just foggy enough to blur the edges of time. The birth of Victorian wealth. It's often said that money doesn't grow on trees, but if you had wandered through Victorian Britain at the height of the 19th century, you might have quietly suspected that some people had found a way to make it sprout from soot, steam, and the occasional ethically questionable business venture. Becoming a millionaire in this era was so far outside the ordinary that the word itself felt slightly unreal, like something you'd find in a fantastical novel rather than in the fog-draped streets of London or the industrial roar of northern England. But millionaires did exist, and the circumstances that created them were a strange combination of ambition, luck, the right connections, and a willingness to dive headfirst into the chaos of a rapidly changing world. To step into that world, imagine the country in transition. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke. Railways stitched themselves across the land like metallic veins, and factories churned out everything from steel to soap at a pace that would have startled earlier generations. Britain was swelling into the kind of global power that liked to brag quietly, in a way that somehow felt louder than actual shouting. And in the middle of all this transformation were the individuals who caught the rising tide and were swept, somewhat dramatically, into wealth that could, quite literally, reshape their lives. But let's slow the picture down a little, as if we're watching this from a carriage window. The story of Victorian wealth didn't begin with someone waking up one morning to find a chest of gold under the bed. It began with the Industrial Revolution, which had the charming effect of taking traditional lifestyles and tossing them out the nearest window. New machines meant new industries. New industries meant new fortunes. And new fortunes meant that suddenly a small but noticeable group of people found themselves looking around at their fellow citizens and thinking, so this is what being extremely wealthy feels like. Some of these millionaires had made their money in textiles, cotton mills humming with frenetic energy, powered by steam engines that hissed and chugged like metallic beasts. Others found their fortune in coal, which was basically the black, dusty lifeblood of the era. There were railway magnates who saw opportunity in steel tracks and ticket prices. There were shipping tycoons who sent goods across the oceans with the confident air of men who believed the world would always be ready to buy whatever they were selling. There were bankers and investors who seemed to have a sixth sense for spotting which ventures would explode into profit and which would collapse like a badly designed hat stand. And of course, there were those whose wealth came from the broader empire, investments, trade, and the sprawling networks of colonial commerce that carried both opportunity and controversy with them. Victorian millionaires didn't usually speak of this part too loudly at dinner parties. It was the sort of topic that made people shift in their upholstered chairs. But the fascinating thing about these fortunes wasn't just how they were made. It was what they meant. Because in Victorian society, being rich wasn't merely a financial situation. It was a full-time identity with a list of expectations that could rival the length of a Dickens novel. A millionaire was not only someone with more money than they could reasonably spend, they were someone who had, whether intentionally or not, stepped into a role that demanded constant performance. If you were a Victorian millionaire, every morning you woke up carrying the invisible weight of public scrutiny, ambition, and societal judgment. And it all began with the reputation you built around how you obtained your fortune. Old money families, with their sprawling estates and their dusty family portraits, were often wary of the newly rich. They had an uncanny ability to tell whether someone's wealth had been around long enough to develop a respectable layer of historical dust. If it hadn't, well, you might find that some doors, especially the very polished, very expensive ones, remained closed. Still, many of the era's new millionaires were determined to carve out a place at the societal table, even if it meant commissioning portraits that made them look more aristocratic than their ancestors ever were, or purchasing estates that came pre-packaged with a lineage of stone gargoyles. They invested in museums, libraries, and charities. They sponsored orchestras, built wings on hospitals, founded scholarships, and made donations large enough to earn themselves a respectable paragraph in the local newspaper. After all, nothing said, "I absolutely deserve to be here," like a carefully curated public image sprinkled with philanthropy. But let's step back from public life and focus on the quieter and more revealing part of the story, the personal experience of rising to wealth in Victorian Britain. Imagine someone who started as a modest merchant, perhaps in textiles or shipping, working long days in cramped little offices. Then imagine that one day, after years of steady growth or one exceptionally well-timed investment, their financial tides shift dramatically. Suddenly, the ledgers show numbers that don't look like real numbers anymore. Suddenly, the bank clerks smile a little wider. Suddenly, they're invited to dinners they weren't invited to before. It must have felt surreal, exhilarating, and slightly terrifying in the way that holding something fragile and incredibly valuable can be terrifying. Because becoming a millionaire was one thing, but staying one? That required strategy, discipline, and just the right amount of nerves wrapped in velvet gloves. Railways were one of the most fashionable investments of the time. People spoke of railway stocks the way modern people might talk about exciting new technology, except with more waistcoats and stronger opinions about steam engines. Many of the era's fortunes expanded through these ventures. A well-placed investment in a railway line could change someone's entire life trajectory. But these opportunities weren't without risk. Railway speculation was as volatile as the locomotives themselves, and while some men grew impossibly rich, others learned the hard way that even steel tracks could lead straight off a cliff. Another route to fortune was manufacturing. The Victorian era was a world of factories, whirring machinery, towering chimneys, and the constant thrum of industry. A factory owner who introduced an efficient new machine or produced goods in quantities unimaginable to earlier generations could catapult themselves into staggering wealth. But factories also required constant maintenance, management, labor, and a tolerance for noise levels that would make a modern person reach for earplugs. And then there was banking. Victorian banking was a curious blend of opportunity and etiquette, where fortunes could shift at the speed of a signature. Bankers needed sharp intuition, steady nerves, and the ability to make decisions without flinching, even when the entire economy seemed determined to keep them awake at night. A successful banker could build an empire of credit, loans, investments, and interest rates, all woven together into something that resembled a very elegant financial web. The unifying thread in all of this was the feeling of stepping into a new social category. Victorian millionaires didn't just own wealth, they became custodians of it, protectors of it, performers for it. Every investment decision mattered. Every public gesture mattered. Every social encounter mattered. Even the way they drank their tea could communicate more to their peers than any business report. So the birth of Victorian wealth wasn't simply a story of financial gain. It was a story of transformation, a personal metamorphosis from ordinary citizen into a figure wrapped in velvet, burdened with expectations, and illuminated by the warm glow of gas lamps reflecting off polished silver. It was a time when ambition could lift you higher than you'd ever imagined, but also a time when society watched closely, eager to see whether you could keep your balance at the top. And for the Victorian millionaire, standing on that polished, precarious peak, the journey was only beginning. Waking up rich in 19th century London. If you were a Victorian millionaire, your morning did not begin with an alarm clock. Alarm clocks were for people who actually needed to get up on time. Instead, your awakening unfolded like a miniature theatrical production gently staged around your sleeping form. Quiet footsteps, the faint clink of a fire poker meeting coal, the soft swish of heavy curtains drawn open just enough to allow light in, but not so much that it would dare disturb you too abruptly. A properly arranged Victorian morning respected the delicate art of waking up slowly, the way a cat stretches by degrees, or the sun rises only once it feels ready. Picture the room first. A large bed with ornate wooden posts carved into shapes that may or may not resemble mythological creatures greets you. The mattress is stuffed generously enough to remind you that poverty exists somewhere else, far away, in places you no longer have to think about before breakfast. Heavy drapes in deep jewel tones frame the windows, filtering the faint, milky morning light that London specializes in. The air inside is warmer than the air outside, not because the Victorian climate was kind, but because someone woke before you to light a fire. Someone who has already been working long before your eyes flutter open. And there, floating in the faint glow, is the familiar soundtrack of wealth. The steady crackle of the fireplace, the distant clatter of pots from the kitchen several floors below, and the muffled tapping of boots as servants begin their day in a world that revolves around your comfort. Victorian millionaires didn't need alarms. They had entire households trained to anticipate their needs with uncanny precision. Your waking routine is a performance with established choreography. First, a discreet knock at the door. Not too loud, not too soft, just enough to gently announce the presence of the valet or lady's maid. They enter without waiting for you to answer, because that is how the hierarchy works. They pull open the curtains a little more, letting in brighter light and a chilly hint of the outside world's reality. Fog, distant carriage wheels, and the faint cry of a newspaper boy already shouting headlines you won't read yourself. Your clothes have been prepared on a chair near the fireplace, warmed so that you do not have to suffer the indignity of cold fabric. The shoes have been polished to a shine, almost reflective enough to check your hair in. The linens are crisp, the collar stiff, but not too stiff. Your valet knows the precise balance between elegance and circulation. Every detail is accounted for. For a Victorian millionaire, the morning was a ritual of being eased into existence. A gentle transition from dreaming to the day ahead, with the added reassurance that someone else had already dealt with the chaos. Tea arrives first. Always tea. A silver tray, steam curling gracefully upward, accompanied by small biscuits meant to prepare the stomach, as though your digestive system needs a formal invitation before beginning its work. You sip slowly, savoring the warmth, letting the flavors coax you awake while you stare into the middle distance, contemplating nothing in particular. Only after the tea does the conversation begin. Quiet, careful, almost staged. Your valet might inform you of trivial matters with the solemnity of a newsreader. Which appointments are expected today? Whether a tailor is due to arrive? how the weather might influence the evening's social plans. You nod, perhaps mumble a comment, and then return to your tea. Breakfast itself depends on your household standards. A proper Victorian millionaire would not simply eat. Eating required space, time, and at least 2 different sets of cutlery. Breakfast might be served in your bedroom or in a private morning room. The menu leans toward the heavy side: eggs, cold meats, toast, marmalade, kedgeree, fish, pastries, porridge, or anything else that reassures you that scarcity is something experienced by people who live on the other side of the city. You don't prepare any of it. You barely even touch the plates yourself. Dishes appear, disappear, reappear, all conducted with smooth professionalism by hands that remain anonymous unless they're doing something wrong. While you eat, the house hums to life around you. Servants move like shadows, fireplaces are tended, carpets are brushed, lamps are refilled with oil, letters are sorted, the post arrives and is whisked away to your desk. The entire home shifts from stillness to its daytime rhythm with a quiet efficiency you hardly notice. This, after all, is the privilege of wealth. Comfort so consistent it becomes invisible. But beneath this elegance lies an unspoken rule, one that every Victorian millionaire understood instinctively. The morning routine wasn't merely about luxury, it was about maintaining social armor. A polished appearance, a tidy household, a calm breakfast served on silver, all of it formed the foundation of reputation. Society judged you before you even left the house. The way you stepped into the day told everyone what kind of person you were. Were you elegant, proper, successful, respectable? Everything hinged on appearance, and appearance began the moment you got out of bed. After breakfast, the dressing ritual began. Not dressing as in put on shirt, trousers, done. Dressing in the Victorian sense meant layers. Layers of fabric, layers of meaning, layers of social expectation. For men, this meant shirts, waistcoats, coats, cravats, gloves, watches, and footwear chosen according to the precise time of day and nature of any appointments. For women, dressing was practically an engineering project, involving corsets, petticoats, bustles, gowns, jewelry, outerwear, and sometimes more help from servants than most people today would need to assemble an entire furniture set. Your clothing did not just say who you were. It told people how much money you had, how recently you had acquired it, whether you understood fashion well enough to avoid embarrassment, and, most crucially, whether you belonged in the social spaces you frequented. A Victorian millionaire could dress incorrectly and ruin an entire day's worth of networking simply by choosing the wrong coat. Once dressed, you stepped into the hallway where the air felt subtly warmer and the faint smell of polished wood lingered. Paintings lined the walls, portraits of ancestors if you were old money, or landscapes purchased last month if you were newly rich and trying to compensate. The carpet was thick enough to muffle your footsteps, giving you the impression that the house itself wanted you to move through it effortlessly. As you descended the staircase, you might pass servants who bowed or nodded quietly. Their eyes never rose to yours unless invited. This was the etiquette of the era: respectful distance, invisible presence. They performed essential tasks, but society insisted you pretend the tasks performed themselves. By now, the day's first letters awaited you on a polished desk. Business correspondence, social invitations, requests for donations, news from acquaintances traveling abroad. A Victorian millionaire's life was as much about managing connections as managing money. Every piece of mail required a certain tone of response. Accepting an invitation could strengthen alliances. Declining might send the wrong message. Wealth did not grant freedom from etiquette. It made etiquette unavoidable. But the most important part of the morning wasn't the tea, or the dressing, or the letters. It was the quiet moment when you prepared yourself to step outside the house. Victorian London was unpredictable, foggy, busy, crowded, bustling with carts, vendors, and a population density that made privacy a rare luxury. Everyone observed everyone else, especially in wealthy neighborhoods where social ranking was an unspoken sport. Leaving the house meant entering a world where your status was both your shield and your responsibility. Carriage waiting, boots polished, gloves spotless, you approached the door with the slow dignity expected of your position. The butler opened it with the precision of someone who has practiced the gesture thousands of times, revealing the cool morning air, the faint smell of coal smoke, and the sound of hooves clopping on pavement. Stepping out wasn't just a physical act. It was the beginning of your performance for the day. You were a Victorian millionaire, after all, and the world, whether it said so or not, was always watching. The morning routine had done its job. You were prepared, polished, presentable, and encased in the comfortable illusion that life unfolded gently, predictably, and in accordance with your desires. You were ready to face business, society, and whatever subtle competitions the day held. But beneath all that ritual, there lingered a quiet truth. Wealth wasn't only a cushion, it was a responsibility, a performance, and sometimes a burden. Yet, in these early hours, surrounded by warm firelight and polished silver, you could almost forget that. For a moment, the world outside felt distant, and all that mattered was the quiet elegance of the morning. Soon, though, you would step fully into the day, and into a society that judged everything from your carriage to the way you tipped your hat. And in the Victorian world of millionaires, even mornings had meaning. The mansion as a status machine. If the morning ritual of a Victorian millionaire was a gentle drift from sleep into polished existence, then the rest of the day was where the real performance began. Not the frantic, exhausting sort of performance that required sweat or improvisation, nothing so undignified. It was a performance of presence, of being seen, known, acknowledged, and quietly evaluated by a society that measured worth not only by the weight of your coin purse, but by the way you occupied a room, a carriage, a conversation, or even a silence. So once you stepped out into the world, wrapped in your layers of fabric and self-assurance, the day unfurled with a kind of structured unpredictability. Not chaotic. Victorian millionaires didn't do chaos. But a certain rhythm existed, dictated by business, social obligations, and that eternal, unspoken quest to maintain one's place on the social ladder. First came the carriage ride. Victorian millionaires rarely walked unless it was through their own gardens, and even then, only if the weather cooperated. Walking was technically possible, but why risk being mistaken for someone with errands? A carriage communicated dignity. It also communicated wealth. And it communicated that you were not someone who needed to get anywhere quickly. Victorian time for the rich was wonderfully elastic. If you were late, people assumed you had a good reason. If you were early, people assumed you had servants who handled your schedule with supernatural skill. Either way, you won. The carriage interior smelled faintly of leather, polished wood, and whatever perfume or cologne you applied that morning. Outside, the city blurred past in slow motion. Chimney smoke drifting upward like ghostly ribbons, shopkeepers sweeping their doorsteps, hansom cabs rattling across cobblestones, vendors shouting about fish that were allegedly fresh. The world bustled and clattered, but inside the carriage, everything felt muted, softened, as though your wealth formed a kind of buffer against London's sharper edges. Your driver knew the routes well. Drivers always did. They knew which streets to avoid, which shortcuts were acceptable, and how to navigate the unpredictable choreography of horses and pedestrians without jostling you enough to spill your thoughts, or worse, your tea. And while the city moved around you with its usual determined liveliness, your mind drifted toward the day's first engagement: business. For Victorian millionaires, business was less a task and more a lifestyle. Even those who had long retired from real work found themselves attending meetings, reviewing investments, approving expenses, or at least pretending to care about profit margins. Appearances mattered. A millionaire who stopped showing up to their office or counting house risked rumors that they were losing their touch, or worse, their fortune. Your carriage pulled up to your business headquarters, a building that was either proudly industrial or elegantly aristocratic, depending on what your fortune was built upon. Mill owners preferred sturdy brick structures with tall windows and the constant hum of accountants shuffling papers. Bankers favored polished wood interiors, brass railings, glass lamps, and a faintly intimidating air of quiet efficiency. Railway magnates liked spaces filled with maps, schedules, and miniature models of locomotives that were somehow both charming and slightly self-congratulatory. Stepping inside, you were greeted with the respectful nods of clerks who had already been working for hours. Their desks were arranged in neat rows, papers stacked with near military discipline. Calculations were made by hand, letters copied carefully in ink, ledgers balanced with the precision of surgeons. Your presence carried weight. Even if you did nothing but walk through the room, your employees stood a little straighter, dipped their pens more carefully, and pretended not to glance at your shoes, which told them whether you had come prepared to discuss profits or simply wanted to appear busy. Your office, always upstairs, always larger than it needed to be, was a sanctuary of status. Walls lined with books you might one day read, a globe you spun occasionally to appear thoughtful, and an enormous wooden desk meant to communicate, "I am absolutely in charge," without you having to say so. Letters awaited your attention, reports lay open, ink drying in neat lines. Business partners arrived punctually, each eager to present opportunities, expansions, mergers, innovations, or anything else that might tempt your curiosity and, ideally, your money. These meetings rarely involved raised voices. Everything was polite, controlled, wrapped in the seemingly calm veneer of Victorian professionalism. But beneath the pleasantries lurked tension. Competing interests, hidden risks, financial gambles dressed in nice suits. Being a millionaire did not exempt you from stress. It simply packaged it more elegantly. Still, there was a kind of pleasure in it. The slow unfolding of numbers, the negotiation of terms, the subtle game of appearing confident while internally calculating whether this new venture would make you richer or merely keep you awake at night. Victorian millionaires loved opportunity, but they also feared scandal. A failed investment could damage both your fortune and your reputation. And in the Victorian world, sometimes the reputation mattered more. By late morning, business gradually transitioned into something more social. Business lunches weren't quite a formal habit yet, but invitations for midday meetings in private dining rooms or gentlemen's clubs were increasingly common. These were spaces where deals were quietly sealed over cups of strong tea, or, if the establishment permitted, a discreet glass of sherry. The club atmosphere was unmistakable. An aftershave of old tobacco, leather armchairs polished to a warm shine, the soft murmur of men discussing politics, shipping routes, taxes, or scandals they definitely pretended not to enjoy. Clubs were comfort zones for wealthy Victorian men. They were the places where one could nap undisturbed, read newspapers the size of blankets, or engage in the kind of social maneuvering that made the aristocratic look like amateurs. But if you were a Victorian millionaire, newly risen from industry, the clubs could be tricky. Old money families eyed you with polite curiosity, as though you were a new species of bird that had wandered into the wrong garden. They were courteous, this was Victorian England after all, but always measuring, always comparing. You were wealthy, certainly, but were you their kind of wealthy? Navigating these social arenas required tact. Too much confidence made you look arrogant. Too little made you look insecure. Your best strategy was quiet composure, speak when necessary, listen often, and appear knowledgeable without looking like you had recently memorized things to appear knowledgeable. A Victorian millionaire lived in a world where even conversation was a form of currency. After midday obligations, the day shifted into errands of prestige. Philanthropic meetings, charity committees, consultations with architects about renovations or extensions to the estate. Victorian millionaires loved adding rooms to their homes, often for purposes as specific and unnecessary as winter reading room or hallway for displaying particularly large umbrellas. A fortune wasn't static. It needed to be showcased, expanded, polished, and occasionally flaunted in ways that were tastefully restrained but still unmistakable. Sometimes the afternoon meant visiting shops. Not personally, of course, unless you wanted to make a social statement. More often, it was merchants coming to you. Jewelers, tailors, art dealers, antiquarians, importers of silk or porcelain. They visited by appointment, presenting their wares with the gravity of priests offering sacred artifacts. You examined, nodded, selected items with the deliberation of a monarch inspecting tributes, and signed papers that sent money drifting silently from your accounts. But the most fascinating part of a Victorian millionaire's day came in the early evening, when the city began to dim. Not darkness, not yet, just the gentle shift into the softer twilight that London wore so well. Work faded, meetings ended, and society's real theater came alive. Invitations awaited you, requests for your presence. Dinners, musicales, soirees, gatherings hosted by those who wanted you nearby because you were wealthy, interesting, useful, or aesthetically pleasing to the guest list. For the Victorian millionaire, the day wasn't simply a sequence of tasks. It was a carefully curated journey of influence. The morning asserted your competence. The midday blended business and status. The afternoon refined your public character. And the evening? The evening was where alliances formed, impressions solidified, and reputations crystallized under candlelight and murmured conversations. It was tiring, yes, but it was also the price of having wealth in a society obsessed with hierarchy. And as the gas lamps flickered to life in the gathering dusk, you felt that familiar shift, the sense that the quiet elegance of your morning had given way to the intricate dance of your day. The performance was far from over. Dressing for wealth and judgment. The thing about being a Victorian millionaire, beyond the constant need to pretend you're not desperately trying to impress everyone, is that your social life becomes less of a life and more of an ongoing theatrical performance. A kind of never-ending play where the audience is your peers, the stage is the drawing room, and the highlight of the evening is someone pretending to be absolutely thrilled about a new type of lace imported from Belgium. And if you, as the wealthy host, were not dazzling enough, the guests would simply raise one eyebrow, ever so politely, and your entire reputation could quietly evaporate by morning tea. By the time the lamps were lit and the city hummed beneath a thin veil of coal fog, the millionaire households began their evening rituals. Servants moved like shadows, preparing rooms where laughter would echo in the carefully curated way wealthy Victorians believed laughter should. Subdued, refined, and never so bold as to reveal that anyone was having genuine fun. Real enjoyment was considered a bit too common. The invitations for these gatherings were a subtle language of their own. Heavy cardstock, seals with family crests no one could quite trace back any further than an ambitious grandfather, and handwriting so delicate it looked as if the ink was embarrassed to be there. Receiving one meant you were in. Not receiving one meant you might as well exile yourself to the countryside for a week until gossip moved on to someone else's social tragedy. And there were always fresh tragedies. A dress worn twice, a cousin who married beneath their station, or the ultimate scandal, being seen purchasing your own fruit. Inside these grand townhouses, you'd find parlors that smelled faintly of rosewater, cigar smoke, and whatever perfume was fashionable that month. Usually something that proudly announced itself as containing hints of Oriental mystery, courtesy of a marketing team who had never been east of Greenwich. The carpets were thick, the curtains heavier than the emotional weight of every servant in the room, and the gas lights burned just a bit too bright, creating that warm glow Victorians adored, even if it made half the guests squint like nocturnal animals. As a Victorian millionaire, you were expected to glide through this world, offering charming comments, accepting compliments with modesty you didn't actually possess, and demonstrating an effortless knowledge of everything from horse breeding to parliamentary drama. Whether you truly knew anything was beside the point. A confident nod, a thoughtful hum, and a mildly cryptic sentence like, "Ah, yes, but the board's decision last winter does complicate matters," would usually do the trick. The evenings often had entertainments, performances with a capital P. Perhaps a well-bred young lady would play the piano, her hands trembling slightly because her entire future marital market value seemed to depend on whether she hit that high G without faltering. Or a poet would read verses so melancholic and flowery, you'd wonder if he'd mistaken sadness for talent. Guests would murmur appreciatively, even if no one understood half of what he said. It wasn't about understanding. It was about appearing cultured. But the real currency of these gatherings wasn't lace or music or imported porcelain. No, it was conversation. Conversation was everything. Smooth, calm, entirely inoffensive conversation that flowed like gentle river water and revealed absolutely nothing. You weren't there to express opinions. You were there to show you had them. And should the discussion drift into anything too real, poverty, illness, the fact that large parts of the city smelled like smoke and despair, a quiet, elegant pivot would redirect the topic back to safer territory. The latest opera, a cousin's engagement, or a rumor involving a duke, a misplaced hat, and a misunderstanding no one dared clarify. For the Victorian millionaire, hosting was both an art and an unspoken obligation. Your social standing depended on creating an atmosphere where guests felt important, tended to, and slightly intimidated by the polish of your silverware. The table settings alone were a battlefield of etiquette. Forks weren't just forks. They were coded messages of order, refinement, and whether you had the audacity to serve a course out of sequence. One wrong placement, and someone's great aunt might faint out of sheer social distress. Dinner itself was a multi-course performance. Soup that tasted faintly of comfort, fish dishes with names more complicated than the fish themselves, meats arranged in sculptural forms, puddings with ingredients imported from places no one at the table could locate on a map. Each bite came with the expectation of polite approval, though genuine enthusiasm was discouraged. The wealthy were meant to hover in the delicate middle ground between enjoying a meal and being above caring about it. Meanwhile, servants flowed through the scene like a well-rehearsed orchestra. Footmen glided, maids appeared and disappeared with plates as if obeying Victorian teleportation laws, and the butler presided over everything with the serene authority of a man who silently judged each guest but would never, ever admit it. A well-run household was a performance where the audience never saw the frantic behind-the-scenes labor, the stress, the exact timing, the whispered commands, the last-second saves whenever a dish threatened to do anything other than behave perfectly. And then there were the games. Parlor games that, in the modern world, would barely entertain a bored cat, but in Victorian times, they were thrilling. Charades performed with dramatic flair, word puzzles that tested how politely competitive someone could be, and storytelling activities where participants took turns adding sentences to a narrative that invariably devolved into mild absurdity. For a millionaire, these games were less about amusement and more about demonstrating charm. A well-timed, witty remark could do more for your reputation than your entire stock portfolio. And trust me, a poorly timed joke could sink a social season faster than a poorly built steamer. Yet, for all their elegance and candlelit splendor, these gatherings were exhausting. Wealth didn't buy immunity from social pressure. If anything, it magnified every expectation. A Victorian millionaire went to bed long after midnight, the night's laughter still echoing, the polite smiles melting away as soon as the bedroom door closed. They'd collapse into a four-poster bed that looked majestic, but felt roughly as soft as a polished plank, the mattress stuffed with horsehair, because that was somehow considered luxurious. As the house darkened and the last embers in the fireplace glowed faintly, you, imagining yourself as this millionaire, would listen to the quiet creaks of the building settling, The distant footsteps of servants finishing their final duties, and the muffled city outside. You'd lie there, thinking about tomorrow's obligations, tomorrow's impressions to maintain, tomorrow's delicate dance through the social maze. Because being wealthy in Victorian times wasn't a leisurely stroll. It was a performance you could never step out of, a scripted life where every move mattered, every word mattered, every invitation mattered. And every night, as you settled into your stiff, overstuffed mattress, you were reminded that being rich meant living in comfort, but never quite in peace. It was glamour woven tightly with pressure, elegance built on expectations, comfort balanced with constant scrutiny. A life that looked perfect from the outside, but from within felt like a never-ending audition to prove you belonged in a world that could just as swiftly expel you. And tomorrow, the show would begin all over again. A millionaire's social calendar. If there was one thing Victorian millionaires loved more than being wealthy, it was making sure everyone knew they were wealthy, without ever admitting that was their goal. It was an exquisite balancing act, really, a delicate dance between effortless refinement and look upon my imported marble flooring and weep. And nowhere was this balancing act more visible than in the way they dressed and adorned themselves. Clothing wasn't just clothing. It was silent social warfare stitched in silk and embroidered with implications. A Victorian millionaire didn't merely wake up and get dressed. They embarked on a daily ritual of assembling a visual thesis statement declaring, "Yes, I am successful, cultured, important, and absolutely not trying too hard, even though this waistcoat took 12 hours of labor from someone earning a coin a day," because appearances were everything. Being wealthy was only half the job. Looking wealthy, correctly, was the real test. Morning attire, for instance, was deliberately understated. Not plain, heavens no, just subdued enough to whisper refinement rather than shout it. The wealthy preferred fabrics that had that, "I was expensive, but I don't need to brag about it" energy. Soft wools, crisp linens, silks in gentle tones. Everything fitted perfectly because bespoke tailoring was considered more essential than breathing properly. A millionaire would rather suffer through a constricting collar than risk someone noticing a crease out of place. And then there were the accessories, each one a little social signpost. A gentleman's pocket watch wasn't just for checking the time. It was a metallic declaration that he valued precision, order, and had at least 3 generations of reputable ancestors, even if he actually didn't. The chain alone was a strategic choice. Too simple and you looked careless. Too ornate and you risked being labeled vulgar, which in Victorian society was basically the equivalent of being voted off the island. Women's fashion, meanwhile, was a daily endurance test disguised as elegance. A wealthy Victorian lady's wardrobe was a complicated system of corsets, layers, bustles, petticoats, and ornamentation, all designed to create the silhouette considered ideal, a sort of hourglass meets floating ornamental vase aesthetic. Comfort was never part of the equation. If she could breathe easily, something had been done incorrectly. The gowns themselves were marvels of craftsmanship. Yards of satin, velvet, or tulle, decorated with beads, lace, and embroidery delicate enough to make a spider jealous. Colors mattered too. Deep jewel tones whispered affluence. Soft pastels murmured innocence. Black signaled mourning, unless you wore it socially and pretended you weren't making a fashion statement, which of course you absolutely were. And shoes. Well, Victorian shoes were less about walking and more about suffering quietly and gracefully. A proper lady gliding across the room wasn't gliding so much as carefully navigating intense discomfort with the determination of someone who had been trained since childhood to make fortitude look attractive. Jewelry was another battlefield entirely. Wealthy men wore subtle pieces, rings, tie pins, perhaps a signet seal that may or may not have been inherited from a relative who may or may not have existed. Women, however, wore family jewels like portable status banners. Diamonds sparkled, pearls glowed, and brooches announced both taste and purchasing power. The more elaborate the piece, the deeper the message. We are prosperous. We are established. We have opinions on opera seating. Of course, all this elegance required preparation, intense preparation. A Victorian millionaire didn't dress alone. There were servants for everything. Maids for arranging hair, valets for coordinating ties and waistcoats, assistants for brushing lint off jackets that insisted on collecting lint despite costing more than some people earned in a year. Even the act of putting on a glove could require assistance if the material was delicate enough, which it often was. Imagine needing a small team just to ensure your evening gloves didn't wrinkle. That was Victorian wealth. Then there was the grooming itself. Hair was a statement of status, neatly arranged and maintained with an arsenal of combs, oils, and pomades. Men favored tidy facial hair, beards that suggested calm authority, mustaches that implied a certain gravitas, and sideburns that hinted subtly at having opinions about railroads. Women's hairstyles could be towering, intricate constructions requiring hours of careful twisting, pinning, and praying that humidity didn't wage war on their elegance. But beyond clothing, the millionaire's appearance extended into the very air they carried with them. Scents were essential. Perfumes were subtle, floral, or mildly exotic, never overpowering, never tacky, always suggestive of refinement. A wealthy Victorian woman might pass by with a faint trail of rose and bergamot. A wealthy gentleman might smell faintly of sandalwood, a whiff of tobacco, and the quiet suggestion that he spent afternoons reading leather-bound volumes in a private study, even if he didn't. When evening arrived, the transformation fully unfolded. This was when wealthy Victorians truly dressed as if attending a royal gala, even if the event was simply dinner with acquaintances they mildly tolerated. Men wore formal evening attire, tailcoats, crisp white shirts, gleaming shoes, and cravats tied with the mathematical precision of a man who had practiced in a mirror for years. Women wore gowns designed to catch candlelight and admiration from every angle. Silks cascaded, jewels glittered, and fabrics rustled like a soft orchestration of wealth. It wasn't merely fashion, it was an immersive experience. But what made all of this fascinating wasn't just the clothing itself, it was the purpose behind it. In the Victorian world, what you wore determined how people treated you, what assumptions they made about your upbringing, your morals, even your intelligence. Clothing defined your social script before you even spoke. A well-dressed millionaire could command respect simply by entering a room. An improperly dressed one might find doors quietly closing in their face. Even children of wealthy families were participants in this daily spectacle. Little boys in tailored jackets and polished boots. Little girls in frilly dresses with bows so large they could be used as architectural supports. Their appearance wasn't about childhood at all. It was about showing that the family's refinement extended across generations, like a finely embroidered lineage. For the Victorian elite, maintaining this image was relentless. Every garment had to be perfect, every accessory purposeful, every layer intentional. Being wealthy meant curating yourself as carefully as a museum exhibit. And though the glamour looked effortless, behind the scenes it required time, labor, patience, and the kind of tolerance for discomfort that modern humans would reserve only for theme park lines and long-haul flights. Yet, beneath all the polish and preening, there was always a whisper of insecurity. The fear that one misstep, a mismatched accessory, a slightly outdated hemline, a coat worn a year too long, could signal weakness, could invite judgment, could imply that perhaps your wealth wasn't as secure or as generational as you wanted society to believe. And so, the Victorian millionaire continued dressing every day as though preparing for their next masterpiece. Their appearance wasn't simply an outfit, it was armor, camouflage, performance, and status all woven together. And no matter how heavy the fabric or how tight the corset, they carried it all with the serene expression of someone who had been taught never to let the world see them sweat. After all, in Victorian society, elegance was not merely admired, it was expected. And for those fortunate enough to be wealthy, it was the first and most powerful way to declare that they belonged at the top of the world, even while the world constantly demanded new proof. How Victorians showed off money. For a Victorian millionaire, mornings didn't begin with the gentle luxury we tend to imagine. They didn't wake up in a sunlit bedroom, stretch like a satisfied cat, and then casually decide whether to spend the day reading poetry or inspecting their estates. No, Victorian mornings were structured, ritualized, and infused with the underlying pressure of being someone important in a world obsessed with watching you. Even waking up had expectations attached. The day began early, usually because the house itself stirred like some great mechanical creature. Servants moved behind walls and along corridors, their footsteps muffled only slightly by the thick carpeting. Fires had to be rekindled, bathwater heated, drapes opened just enough for light to enter without being bold about it. A successful Victorian household functioned like an organism, with dozens of limbs all working in perfect synchrony, so the master or mistress could enter the day gracefully, and ideally without realizing how much labor went into that grace. When the millionaire finally opened their eyes, the room was already warmed, the faint scent of beeswax polish lingering from the early morning cleaning, and the fire crackling quietly. The bed itself was a masterpiece. Heavy carved wood, embroidered coverlets, pillows arranged with the sort of precision usually reserved for military formations. Rising from it was not so much waking up as it was making an entrance. A knock, gentle but crisp, signaled the beginning of the morning ritual. The valet for a gentleman, or the lady's maid for a woman, entered with the steady competence of someone who performed this routine hundreds of times without a single misstep. Their presence was both comforting and slightly theatrical, like an opening act in the daily performance of wealth. The first task was breakfast ordering. Victorian millionaires did not stumble into the kitchen and fry an egg. They issued morning instructions as if planning a diplomatic meeting. tea, cocoa, coffee imported from somewhere distant enough to sound impressive, a soft-boiled egg, 2 slices of toast, perhaps a dish of fruits arranged with geometric neatness. The meal would be served later in the morning room, but deciding was a key part of the ritual. Routine bred authority. Bathing was next, an ordeal of preparation that today would inspire mild panic. Victorian baths required kettles of water, heated and carried upstairs by servants who undoubtedly questioned, at least once a week, why humans insisted on boiling themselves before sunrise. A millionaire's bathtub gleamed, porcelain if modern, or a heavy copper basin if older. The water was steeped with oils or scented soaps, transforming the experience from mere washing into a luxurious cleansing ceremony that whispered, "Yes, I am a person of status, and even my hygiene is curated." After bathing came grooming, which was essentially an early lesson in patience. A gentleman's hair was combed, trimmed, oiled, and coaxed into whichever shape best conveyed dignity. If he had facial hair, and this being the Victorian era, he probably did, there were additional steps involving brushes and scissors, and the occasional existential question about whether the mutton chop sideburns were starting to look too aggressive. For women, grooming could take considerably longer. Hair was not simply hair. It was an architectural project, often requiring heated curling irons, pins, ribbons, combs, and the delicate touch of a maid who had perfected the art of creating elegance without pulling too hard. Victorian hairstyles were triumphs of patience, endurance, and the unspoken hope that no strong breeze would appear later in the day. Dressing followed, and dressing was an event in itself. A gentleman required layers, shirts, waistcoats, trousers fitted precisely, a morning coat that suggested competence, boots polished to a near mystical shine. A lady required more layers than a geological formation: camise, corset, petticoats, bustle, stockings, and finally the gown, complete with its layers of fabric and fastenings. A millionaire did not simply step into their clothes, they were assisted, adjusted, smoothed into perfection. And then came the accessories: the watch, the brooch, the gloves, the jewelry that discreetly, or not so discreetly, announced wealth. Even a handkerchief mattered. Too ornate, and it risked seeming flashy. Too plain, and you might be mistaken for a person who didn't understand refinement. The Victorian elite were constantly performing a delicate ballet of taste. Once dressed, the millionaire made their way to the morning room. It was a space engineered for serenity, warm, comfortable, furnished with plush chairs, elegant wallpapers, a window view that allowed soft daylight to spill inside without exposing one to the less picturesque elements of Victorian cities. Breakfast waited, arranged neatly on porcelain dishes, with silverware polished so brilliantly one could practically check their reflection in it. The meal itself was never rushed. Even if the millionaire had a full day ahead, meetings, estate matters, social engagements, they approached breakfast with calm deliberation. Eating quickly was considered uncouth. One savored. One discussed plans with a spouse. One read the morning paper, holding it at just the right angle to avoid smudging ink on gloves. Ah, yes, the newspaper. A millionaire needed to appear informed, even if they skimmed most of it. They would absorb headlines about politics, railroads, overseas affairs, and the occasional scandal. Most of all, they scanned for anything that might affect their investments or their reputation. The Victorian era loved gossip almost as much as it loved propriety. By mid-morning, the millionaire's day officially began. For men, this might mean stepping into a carriage to head toward business affairs, a gentleman's club, a bank, a board meeting, or an office. Though, to be clear, wealthy Victorian men didn't work in the way ordinary people did. They supervised, advised, inspected, and occasionally approved things. They existed in rooms where decisions were made, usually while sipping tea and pretending to consider the opinions of others. For women, the late morning often included tasks equally intricate: writing letters, directing servants, reviewing household accounts, choosing menus, and preparing for afternoon visits. Victorian households required management on the scale of small companies, and the mistress of the house ran it with a mixture of precision, calm, and the ability to detect dust from alarming distances. Social obligations also emerged. A wealthy Victorian might call on acquaintances, exchanging polite conversation about health, travel, or the weather. Never anything personal, never anything messy. Or friends might stop by unexpectedly, which was always a test of readiness. A millionaire's home had to be prepared at all times to welcome guests without revealing a single sign of disarray. From morning to noon, the millionaire navigated a world of schedules, expectations, subtle performances. Every gesture mattered. Every word mattered. Even silence had to be deliberate. And underlying it all was the constant weight of maintaining the household machine, a machine powered by dozens of people who woke even earlier and worked far harder to keep the illusion intact. The servants' hall was busy long before the millionaire ever opened their eyes, but the millionaire was encouraged not to notice. Their role was simply to glide through their home as though everything happened naturally, effortlessly. But being wealthy didn't shield them from small irritations. Letters arrived demanding attention. A business partner might send a cryptic note. A distant relative might announce an inconvenient visit. Or worse, fashion might shift slightly, requiring adjustments to one's wardrobe to remain respectable. By the time midday approached, the Victorian millionaire had already completed an entire morning of rituals, decisions, and atmospheric expectations. But to the outside world, it looked as though they'd done nothing more than gracefully exist. That was the point. The surface was serene. The work, performed by dozens of others, remained invisible. And the millionaire stepped into the next portion of the day prepared, polished, and perfectly aligned with the delicate social machinery of the era. Because in Victorian society, success wasn't merely about wealth. It was about cultivating an aura, a presence, a version of yourself so meticulously assembled that not even your morning hair could betray you. And so, morning gave way to afternoon, and the performance continued. Power, politics, and soft control. Afternoons for a Victorian millionaire were a strange blend of leisure, obligation, and carefully choreographed appearances. They were the hours where nothing was supposed to look like work, even though half the day's most important social maneuvers happened between tea trays, carriage rides, and conversations held under the polite disguise of small talk. Afternoon wasn't just a time of day, it was an arena. A stage lit by soft daylight, where reputations were nudged upward or quietly flattened. Once the midday meal, a light affair, unless guests were present, had faded into the background, the millionaire transitioned into what society called the afternoon hours. These were precious. They were social currency, and they were judged heavily by how one spent them. For many wealthy men, the afternoon began with a trip to one of their clubs. Victorian gentlemen's clubs were not the rowdy establishments the modern term might suggest. They were sanctuaries of leather chairs, cigar smoke drifting in lazy spirals, marble fireplaces, and the faint scent of brandy warming in crystal glasses. A club was where men discussed politics, railways, investments, and the latest whisper about someone's questionable business decisions, all while pretending none of it mattered too much. Entering a club was like stepping into a bubble where time slowed, conversation deepened, and the outside world politely waited at the door until you were finished being important. A millionaire could spend hours there without actually accomplishing anything tangible, yet emerge feeling as though he had contributed to the grand machinery of the empire by merely offering opinions in a low, thoughtful voice. It was Victorian productivity at its finest. A gentleman might sit with acquaintances, calling them friends was too forward, and exchange updates on shipping routes, stock ventures, political rumors, and occasionally something personal, though only at the level of, "My cousin's daughter has taken ill," or "The governess has resigned." Everything said was filtered through layers of decorum. Real emotion was often treated like contraband. Meanwhile, a wealthy Victorian woman had her own intricate landscape to navigate. Her afternoons unfolded in drawing rooms, gardens, carriages, tea houses, or boutiques. These excursions were subtle power plays, disguised as gentle recreation. One of the defining rituals of the afternoon was making social calls. These were brief visits to acquaintances' homes, usually lasting no more than 15 minutes, just enough time to exchange pleasantries, admire a new vase, and subtly remind the household that you still existed and were, ideally, doing well. The calling card, a small engraved token of your presence, was left behind as a kind of social footprint. Its weight, thickness, and typography spoke volumes. Women were the reigning strategists of the social call system. They remembered who owed them a call, who they owed in return, and who was to be politely avoided because they'd recently fallen out of fashion. One wrong call could send ripples through the social fabric. Too frequent, and you seemed desperate. Too rare, and you appeared aloof. It was all a delicate balance held together with lace gloves and the patience of a saint. For those who preferred shopping to calling, Victorian London offered endless temptations. A lady might visit a milliner's shop to examine the season's newest hats, each adorned with feathers, ribbons, silk flowers, or, occasionally, entire small birds, tastefully arranged, of course. Another stop might be a dressmaker's studio, where fabrics in every shade flowed like rivers, waiting to be shaped into gowns worthy of evening events. Browsing was an art. Buying was an announcement. Even selecting fabric could be a performance, with the dressmaker lifting rolls of velvet or silk while the lady's maid nodded discreetly in the background, signaling approval or concern with the subtlety of a seasoned diplomat. Afternoons also invited leisurely carriage rides through parks, the Victorian equivalent of being seen in the right neighborhood at the right time. Hyde Park, for example, was a favorite. Wealthy families rode through in elegant carriages, polished to a glossy shine, hoping to encounter acquaintances, or at least check who else was out. A stroll or ride wasn't about exercise, it was about visibility. One might see a millionaire gentleman guiding his horse with a straight posture, hat tilted just so, projecting an image of calm mastery. A wealthy woman, dressed in her afternoon gown, might sit beside him, gloved hands folded delicately, expression serene and unbothered. In truth, she might be silently critiquing the hat choices of every other lady in sight, because Victorian fashion was competitive sport. Of course, not every afternoon was spent in external pursuits. Some millionaires devoted their time to the management of their estates, investments, or philanthropic committees. Being wealthy meant participating in the cultural pageantry of charitable events, fundraisers, lectures, committees dedicated to improving the lives of the less fortunate, usually from a comfortable distance. Not attending these gatherings risked appearing selfish, while attending too eagerly risked appearing performative. Again, balance ruled everything. Letters were another essential part of afternoon life. Victorian correspondence was practically its own literary genre. Millionaires exchanged letters with friends, business partners, distant relatives, and the occasional social climber seeking support. Writing a letter required tone, tact, and a careful avoidance of anything that could scandalize. A simple note could take 20 minutes, as each sentence was calibrated to sound polite yet meaningful, friendly yet proper. The post, delivered multiple times a day, kept society in constant circulation. Tea marked the turning point of the afternoon. Around 4 o'clock, households transitioned into a soft, warm ritual that blended nourishment and social theater. Tea trays appeared, fine china, silver spoons, small cakes, biscuits, sandwiches with crusts removed. The millionaire and their companions, family or guests, gathered to enjoy this moment of calm civility. Tea was more than a drink. It was a reset button for the day, a way to smooth out tensions and prepare for the evening's obligations. Conversations during tea were lighter than morning discussions, but more personal than evening chatter. People spoke of the day's small victories, a new hat purchased, a letter received, a committee meeting that didn't devolve into thinly veiled disagreements about church pew allocations. Ideas floated gently, like the steam rising from the pot, and for a moment the world felt orderly. But even tea came with expectations. A proper Victorian millionaire didn't gulp or slouch or show too much enthusiasm. They poured precisely, stirred quietly, sipped elegantly. Servants hovered nearby, ready to replace empty plates or refill cups with silent efficiency. Even at rest, the wealthy existed in a world of ritual. As the afternoon waned, preparations for evening began creeping into the edges of thought. There were wardrobe changes to consider, grooming to revisit, plans to confirm. Evening events demanded their own energy, and the afternoon served as a gentle slope leading toward them. Some afternoons ended with reading, but not the escapist kind. Millionaires preferred books that reinforced their intellectual image: travel accounts, poetry, scientific treatises, historical volumes. Novels were acceptable, but only the right kinds, meaning literature that wouldn't cause raised eyebrows at dinner parties. Others ended with music, sketching, embroidery, or quiet reflection near the fireplace. A Victorian millionaire rarely had idle time. Even their leisure was structured. It had purpose. It signaled refinement. It soothed the mind without disrupting dignity. And yet, for all their elegance, Victorian afternoons carried an undercurrent of fatigue, a gentle weariness born of constant expectation. The millionaire was never truly off stage. The world watched their choices, admired their polish, silently judged their missteps. Afternoon was a respite, yes, but a curated one. As shadows lengthened across the drawing room carpets and the golden glow of late sun softened the world, the Victorian millionaire prepared for the next phase of the day, the evening, where appearances sharpened and social stakes rose. But for now, in these last moments of afternoon calm, everything was still, polished, balanced, as though the universe briefly aligned to give the wealthy a breath before plunging them back into society's ever-watchful gaze. The hidden life behind closed doors. Victorian millionaires liked to pretend they had conquered the world, but the truth is that most of them spent their lives trying to keep the world from conquering them. And if you were one of these wealthy souls, Chapter 8 of your everyday routine introduced you to a place where money wasn't merely displayed, it was weaponized. That place was your garden. Or, to be more accurate, your private, curated, obsessively preened stretch of land where the natural world was expected to behave like a well-trained butler. Now, a garden might not sound dramatic, but in Victorian high society, it wasn't just some quiet place to plant roses and shoo away the occasional squirrel. No, your garden was proof that you had the kind of wealth that could bend nature to your will. Because while the average Londoner was living in cramped rooms where even a sliver of sunlight felt like a luxury, you were casually commissioning landscapes that looked like someone had bribed Eden to behave itself. So let's imagine you, our cozy Victorian millionaire, stepping out into your morning air, wrapped in a robe thick enough to count as a type of minor armor against the British chill. A footman opens the door, of course. Millionaires didn't touch doorknobs. That was practically manual labor. You wander into a garden so manicured that even the hedges look nervous. Everything is trimmed to perfection, shaped, styled, combed, coaxed, and occasionally threatened into aesthetic submission. The paths beneath your feet are crushed gravel because actual dirt is for poor people, and you don't want to be reminded that soil exists. The fountains, yes, fountains, plural, are bubbling like a gentle reminder that water is yours to control in elegant, decorative bursts. And the birds? Let's just say Victorian gardeners knew how to attract the pretty ones and discourage the loud ones. The birds you get are soft, melodious, delicate. No pigeons allowed. They're practically screened at the gate. But the garden isn't just nature-themed bragging rights. It serves a deeper purpose, calming your mind after a morning of trying to look important while reading letters you didn't want to respond to. Millionaires had a talent for receiving correspondence and then doing absolutely nothing about it. You'd stroll among your imported, carefully arranged plants, many from colonies the empire would prefer not to discuss too closely, letting the greenery convince you that you had control over your existence. Even though, ironically, the very people who built and maintained this garden, your gardeners, were the ones with actual power over whether your prized orchids lived or died. And they knew it. Quietly, politely, professionally. But they knew. Moving through the garden, you might come across a conservatory, often the pride of any Victorian estate. A towering glass structure that housed plants too delicate to survive the British climate, meaning plants that were just as high maintenance as their owner. You'd step inside and be greeted by warm humidity, rare greenery, and the subtle sense that you were trespassing into a place nature didn't intend for humans. But you owned it, so that made everything acceptable. These conservatories were expensive. In fact, they were so expensive that other wealthy families judged you by the size of your glass house, like modern people judge phone models. The goal was to keep your guests slightly envious, never comfortable, never equal, just impressed enough to remember who had more money. And while you wandered through your foreign ferns and perfectly pampered palms, your mind drifted to the evening, when your garden would serve its second purpose, staging gatherings that looked effortless despite requiring an army of staff to pull off. Summer evenings especially were prime time for outdoor displays of wealth. Not the loud, flashy kind, but the quiet, heavy, unmistakable kind. Candlelit paths, lanterns glowing like little captured stars, and a quartet playing music that made you feel cultured even if you barely understood any of it. Your guests would stroll through your property as if they were inspecting a museum exhibit, making polite comments about your floral arrangements while calculating how much everything must have cost. Victorians excelled at pretending they weren't impressed while being absolutely, profoundly impressed. They would sip their drinks, nod at the beauty around them, and secretly wonder what sort of fortune it took to maintain grounds like yours. And yes, there was always the occasional guest who tried to loudly declare that they preferred a more natural look in gardens. But these statements were always made while admiring your roses up close, so they didn't carry much weight. But your garden served one final purpose, one nobody spoke about, but everyone knew: reflection. In the quiet morning or late evening, this was the place where a millionaire could walk in peace while the rest of London clanged, shouted, and coughed its way through industrial chaos. You'd look at your trees and flowers and fountains, and for a brief moment, life felt orderly, predictable, almost comforting. And it helped settle your mind at night, too. When the lamps dimmed and the estate softened into silence, the view of your own carefully maintained landscape helped you unwind. You might stand at your window, watching the moon paint silver across the lawn, telling yourself that tomorrow would be just as peaceful, just as controlled, just as elegantly managed as today. Of course, you were lying to yourself. Victorian society was a storm of economic shifts, political tension, and social transformation. But in your garden, it didn't feel like any of that mattered. You could drift, breathe, settle down, and feel insulated from the real world, much like someone drifting off to sleep with a relaxing voice murmuring about the past. And that's the irony of Victorian wealth. You'd built a garden to control nature, but really, it was designed to control you, your stress, your self-importance, your sense of security. When everything else in your life required posturing, negotiating, impressing, or pretending, the garden was the one space where you could stop performing for a moment, a place that allowed your mind to soften, settle, unwind. And in a society obsessed with appearances, that small mercy was worth every penny of your enormous horticultural budget. Where the money really came from. Evening in the life of a Victorian millionaire had a peculiar rhythm. It wasn't merely about relaxation. It was about performing relaxation, so that every gesture, every sip of tea or glass of wine, every nod or smile carried the weight of social expectation. Daylight faded slowly, leaving the city cloaked in that faint mist London did so well, a mixture of fog, smoke, and the gentle aura of possibility. For the wealthy, this was the time when their carefully maintained facades were most tested, when reputation could be won, or quietly eroded in candlelit parlors and polished drawing rooms. The day's obligations were not over when the sun dipped. In fact, they were only shifting. Dinner invitations, soirees, charity gatherings, and theatrical outings awaited those with the means to attend. Each event was an opportunity to subtly remind the world that you were comfortably at the top, that you were wealthy, cultured, and never, ever flustered. And of course, these evenings were carefully curated to be just long enough to tire the body without exhausting the social image. A Victorian millionaire's stamina was legendary because it had to be. Social performance was a full-time job. Before leaving the house, proper preparation was key. Evening dress was an entire ritual unto itself. For men, this meant the tailcoat, perfectly starched shirt, cravat tied with practiced precision, and polished shoes so immaculate they reflected candlelight like a still pond. The fit, the cut, the fold of the cloth, all silently conveyed competence, refinement, and the kind of attention to detail that whispered, "I am in control." Even a slight crease could betray weakness, a misjudged knot, an amateur's hand. Every element mattered, down to the choice of pocket watch or cufflink. Women, as always, faced an even more labyrinthian process. Evening gowns were masterpieces of fabric, embroidery, and the occasional sparkle of gemstone. Corsets tightened the silhouette to perfection, petticoats added necessary volume, and a trained maid or two ensured that hair, jewelry, and gloves were flawless. Every strand of hair, every fold of lace, every gleam of jewelry was part of the performance, and a misstep could echo through a drawing room conversation long after the evening ended. Even when seated quietly, a lady's posture, the tilt of her chin, the gentle movement of her hands could announce status, breeding, and impeccable taste without saying a single word. Once prepared, the millionaire made their way to the carriage. The streets were alive with a dim, smoky glow, lamps flickering against the fog like tiny sentinels. Walking was rarely an option for the wealthy. It was far too pedestrian, too vulnerable. A carriage provided privacy, authority, and a comfortable buffer against the chaotic bustle of the city below. Horses clipped over cobblestones, their hooves creating a rhythm that became almost hypnotic, blending with the gentle sway of the carriage interior, scented faintly with leather, polish, and whatever subtle perfume or cologne had been applied that day. Even the route was part of the display. The millionaire's carriage might pass by notable theaters, fashionable shopping districts, or estates of other wealthy families, each carefully chosen to reinforce presence, prestige, and the silent suggestion, "I am here, I belong, I observe." Onlookers caught glimpses of elegantly dressed passengers, glimpses enough to stir admiration or envy. Visibility was an unspoken requirement. Being wealthy meant being noticed, even when pretending indifference. Arriving at the evening event, one entered spaces meticulously prepared to reinforce social hierarchies. Candlelight was soft but illuminating, allowing faces to glow without exposing flaws. Carpets and draperies muffled sound, creating a hushed, intimate atmosphere where conversations could be observed, guided, and evaluated. Hosts arranged seating and flow in subtle patterns designed to highlight connections, to elevate certain guests, and to remind everyone present of their place. Even the placement of chairs and tables could influence perception. Who sat where, who arrived first, who was nearest the most impressive artworks or flower arrangements. Dinner itself was an elaborate dance. Courses appeared in a precise sequence: soup, fish, meats, vegetables, puddings. Each dish communicated refinement. Silverware had a purpose and a strict order, and napkins were not merely for cleanliness, they were instruments of decorum. Conversation at the table had its own unspoken rules: no loud laughter, no controversial topics, no interruptions. Polite interest was required, with occasional murmurs of approval for culinary skill or table presentation. Any misstep could result in subtle, nearly imperceptible judgments that might echo through the social season. Between courses, hosts observed guests with the subtle attentiveness of someone conducting a symphony. Was the gentleman seated opposite nodding too eagerly? Was the lady on the right smiling too little? These micro details mattered, for Victorian society thrived on nuance. Even a fleeting glance could communicate allegiance, disapproval, or subtle invitation. And the wealthy, more than anyone else, understood that their worth wasn't merely counted in coins, but in composure and the impression they left on those around them. After dinner, the evening unfolded into entertainment: music, dancing, or parlor games designed to showcase culture without seeming contrived. A string quartet might perform, its melodies soft but rich, inviting appreciation without demanding expertise. Dance could be polite waltzes, the carefully guided steps reinforcing social norms, or improvisational displays of skill masked by practiced modesty. Games tested wit and subtlety, a charade here, a puzzle there, always ensuring guests appeared clever without ever revealing too much. Drinks were served, always lightly, never in excess. A Victorian millionaire maintained the balance between enjoyment and decorum, knowing that intoxication could erode years of cultivated reputation. Tea, sherry, or claret were consumed in delicate sips, and each gesture was deliberate. Even the placement of one's glass communicated subtle signals about temperament, self-control, and taste. And throughout all this, the mind of the millionaire was quietly calculating who admired what. Who seemed vulnerable to influence? Which alliances could be strengthened tonight? Which conversations planted seeds for future opportunities? Wealth in the Victorian world wasn't just inherited or earned. It was constantly defended, subtly leveraged, and discreetly broadcast. Every gathering, no matter how charming or genteel, was a stage for influence. As evening deepened, the tempo slowed. Guests departed quietly, complimenting the host and performing that delicate ritual of polite gratitude. Invitations for future gatherings might be extended or discreetly implied. Farewells were more than social niceties. They were signals, carefully timed and executed, allowing hosts to measure loyalty, enthusiasm, and taste. Returning home, the millionaire's carriage carried them back through quiet streets now darkened and softened by fog. The city outside had changed. Where once the bustling bustle of commerce marked the day, now a hushed serenity pervaded, broken only by the occasional lamp glow or carriage passing. The wealthy could feel a subtle thrill. The night belonged to them in a way the day never fully allowed. They could observe, reflect, and prepare for tomorrow's performance. And then, finally, they returned to the estate. The doors closed with a solid thud behind them, the servant staff ensuring warmth, order, and a comforting routine. Fires were rekindled, candles replaced, tea prepared for the late-night pause before bed. Evenings ended as quietly as they began, with a sense of accomplishment, a feeling of social survival, and the knowledge that every carefully managed gesture, every word, every glance had contributed to maintaining a life perched delicately atop society. In those final hours before sleep, a Victorian millionaire could allow themselves a moment of private reflection. Perhaps they sipped from a warm cup of tea, settled into a deep chair, and let the day's meticulous orchestration fade. The social performance, the precision of attire, the careful choreography of conversation, all could be temporarily laid aside. They had survived another day, navigated the labyrinth of expectations, and ensured that tomorrow would continue the cycle of wealth, influence, and gentle dominance over the world around them. Yet, even in those quiet moments, the mind never fully rested. The legacy, the fortune, the social standing, they were all fragile constructions, sustained by perception and constant vigilance. Being wealthy in Victorian times was not merely about comfort or security. It was about maintaining a carefully honed equilibrium, the delicate interplay of appearance, influence, and control that defined every hour from dawn to dusk. And for the millionaires, this equilibrium demanded attention, strategy, and an almost meditative dedication to the art of living well while appearing effortless. By the time they finally climbed into their four-poster beds, the city outside had grown quiet, the lamps dimmed, and the fog thickened into a gentle hush. They could close their eyes knowing that, for the moment, they were safe, admired, and in control. Tomorrow, of course, would require repetition of every ritual, every performance, every meticulous action that had defined today. But tonight, they could rest, briefly, gracefully, assuredly, until the cycle began again. Interactions with servants and staff. The late evening in a Victorian millionaire's life often blurred into a quiet kind of theater, a performance meant not for guests, but for themselves. Once the social engagements were over, the dinners concluded, and the carriage wheels had long faded into the distance, the millionaire returned to the grand house, which, by this hour, felt simultaneously like a sanctuary and a stage set. Here, in these dimly lit halls, they could engage in the final acts of the day: contemplation, reflection, and the subtle affirmation of status through domestic perfection. Even when alone, the wealthy never truly relaxed. The household still moved with precise rhythm: servants tidying, fires stoked, lamps checked, water for tea drawn, a candle replaced here or there. Everything had to be perfect, not for the eyes of strangers, but because perfection was expected from those with the means to command it. To allow disorder was to admit vulnerability, and vulnerability was a currency the Victorian elite could ill afford to spend. In one of the quieter drawing rooms, a millionaire might settle into a high-backed chair, feet resting on a low stool, hands clasped over a cup of warm tea. The room smelled faintly of polished wood, beeswax, and faint traces of tobacco, a scent that suggested taste without seeming ostentatious. On the walls, oil paintings of ancestors watched with silent judgment, each portrait a reminder that the family line depended not merely on wealth, but on the continuation of a carefully cultivated image. Even these artworks, in all their somber majesty, reinforce the subtle hierarchy of the household. You were here and you belonged, but only because you performed well enough to merit your place. Books were another form of evening solace. The millionaire might select a volume of poetry, history, or philosophy, Not to engage deeply necessarily, but to reinforce a sense of cultivated intellect. The pages themselves carried weight, as if the act of holding them, leafing through them with deliberate care, demonstrated a refinement others could only aspire to. Occasionally, a note might fall out, a letter saved from earlier in the day, carefully read, but never responded to immediately, because prioritizing leisure over obligation was a delicate art. Even in these private hours, the mind of the wealthy was never idle. Thoughts flickered between personal indulgence and social calculus. Which acquaintances had impressed, which had disappointed? Who might prove useful tomorrow? What minor adjustments to attire, speech, or demeanor were needed for the next day's engagements? Victorian millionaires existed in a constant state of anticipation, always preparing for appearances, always measuring perception, even in moments meant for rest. For women, the late evening also involved reflection on the household, the family, and the delicate balance of social responsibilities. A mistress might sit by a softly lit table, pen in hand, drafting letters for tomorrow, reviewing social invitations, or quietly adjusting arrangements for the next day's garden visits, charitable commitments, or afternoon teas. Each decision, no matter how small, was a signal, either an assertion of competence or a subtle risk to be managed. Every movement had to harmonize with expectations, and the carefully crafted facade had to be preserved, even in solitude. In the library, a millionaire might indulge in minor entertainments designed for contemplation rather than excitement. A puzzle, a map, or a globe of the world, the kind imported from distant lands, could provide hours of quiet engagement. They traced imagined trade routes, examined colonial holdings, and considered investments. This mental wandering was a blend of leisure and subtle preparation. Knowing the world and projecting mastery over it was part of sustaining wealth, even if the acts themselves were mostly symbolic. The home itself contributed to this quiet drama. High ceilings, heavy curtains, thick rugs, and polished furniture gave the impression of permanence and control. But this permanence required constant attention: lamps cleaned and polished, silverware dusted, upholstery inspected for signs of wear. Wealth was not merely displayed in grandiosity, it was defended in maintenance, cultivated in the margins, and reinforced through the daily care of objects that silently broadcast one's status. Tea or cocoa served as a companion to these contemplations, a gentle ritual signaling the transition from day to night. The beverage itself was more than refreshment. It was a small indulgence, a quiet affirmation of refinement. Pouring carefully, sipping slowly, savoring the warmth. The act mirrored the life they led, measured, deliberate, and controlled. Even a minor spill or a clumsy movement would have been unthinkable, an imperfection too blatant for someone who had spent the entire day orchestrating an image of composure. Music, too, often provided an evening backtap. A piano might play softly in the corner, whether performed by a visiting musician or the millionaire themselves. The sound was soothing, atmospheric, a private soundtrack to reflection. Pieces chosen were always culturally appropriate, classical, subdued, evocative rather than dramatic. Music in the evening did not demand applause. It merely wrapped the household in an aura of elegance and intellect. And yet, for all its careful planning, the evening was also a time for minor indulgences, subtle escapes from constant performance. A millionaire might explore a secret drawer, flip through letters of correspondence long saved, or open a small box of treasures collected during travels abroad. These objects, exotic trinkets, miniature sculptures, curiosities, were less about display than private delight. They were reminders that wealth afforded small pleasures inaccessible to the general public, pleasures to be enjoyed quietly, without audience or annotation. By now, the household had begun to grow quieter. Servants completed their rounds, fires smoldered gently, and shadows crept along the walls as the final lamps flickered. The millionaire might walk through a corridor, glancing at portraits or family heirlooms, each glance a silent acknowledgement of lineage, expectation, and legacy. Even as their mind began to settle, there was a constant, subtle awareness of the responsibilities wealth imposed. They were guardians of reputation, conductors of social choreography, and curators of domestic grandeur. Preparation for bed was another ritual. Dressing gowns were worn, slippers adjusted, and finally, the millionaire approached the bedroom. Here, at last, the day's performances could be set aside, if only briefly. The four-poster bed, thickly stuffed and draped, promised comfort and a soft reprieve. Yet even here, thoughts lingered. The next day's engagements, investments, letters, and appearances hovered like faint specters. Victorian millionaires never truly escaped responsibility, because wealth demanded vigilance, even in the liminal space between wakefulness and sleep. As they lay down, the house quiet except for the soft hum of distant streets or the crackling of the fire, the millionaire might allow themselves a sense of accomplishment. Another day of precise performance had been navigated successfully. The meals, the carriage rides, the invitations, the attentions, the conversation, each had been handled with care and skill. Each gesture had preserved reputation, reinforced status, and maintained the delicate equilibrium of wealth. And yet, there was also a trace of exhaustion, a subtle acknowledgement that life at the top was both gilded and demanding. Even in private, the weight of appearance, expectation, and legacy pressed lightly but persistently. The millionaire's mind, trained for constant assessment, reflection, and planning, began to soften only gradually. This was the rhythm of Victorian nights, a blend of indulgence and discipline, comfort and vigilance, solitude and reflection. It was the quiet after the day's performances, the slow exhalation before the dawn of new duties, the soft hum of domestic order that reminded the wealthy that, despite all appearances, life required careful attention, even when the world outside slept. In these hours, the millionaire could finally drift into a form of private contemplation. The day had ended, the house was calm, the garden and city lay in misty quiet beyond the windows. And as eyelids grew heavy, the knowledge of wealth, control, and influence achieved through careful, constant performance allowed for a temporary surrender to sleep, a temporary peace earned through an entire lifetime of vigilance, elegance, and subtle dominance over a world that always demanded more than money alone could provide. The city outside their window. Night was a curious time for a Victorian millionaire. For most Londoners, darkness was a simple transition from activity to sleep, from labor to rest. For the wealthy, it was more complex, a liminal space where control could slip, reflection deepened, and imagination wandered into corners rarely visited in daylight. Once the house was quiet and servants had retreated to their own quarters, the millionaire found themselves alone with a silence that was almost theatrical, punctuated only by the soft tick of a clock, the occasional rustle of curtains, and the distant sounds of the city beyond thick walls. In these hours, even small actions carried symbolic weight. Lighting a single lamp, opening a book, pouring a final cup of tea, all these gestures were acts of personal ritual, as if every movement confirmed order against the creeping chaos of the world outside. The millionaire had spent the day performing mastery, navigating social obligations, and curating appearances. Now, in the quiet, they performed something subtler. Mastery is self, of thought, of atmosphere. Some millionaires preferred to wander the halls at night. A house of this size, grand, sprawling, filled with corridors, staircases, and quiet alcoves, became a private labyrinth once the servants had gone to bed. Each room offered a glimpse into a different aspect of life: the study, lined with books, maps, and curiosities; the drawing room, softly illuminated by the fire; the gallery, where portraits of ancestors seemed to watch silently. Walking slowly, one could feel the weight of generations, of wealth accumulated and maintained, and of expectations that stretched like invisible threads through the house. The study was often the centerpiece of nighttime reflection. Here, the millionaire could settle into a chair, perhaps beside a fire whose glow made the shadows of the room sway gently across the walls. A pipe, cigar, or simply a cup of tea provided comfort and ritual. Books might be read, letters examined, accounts reviewed. But reading was less about information than about maintaining the image of intellect and cultivated taste. Victorian millionaires valued appearances of knowledge even more than knowledge itself, and the study allowed them to live both, the reality and the performance, in parallel. Letters played a peculiar role in these nocturnal hours. Some were unread, set aside in the afternoon as deliberate acts of avoidance. Others were reviewed quietly, read not for urgency, but for subtle cues: the tone, the phrasing, the small slips that revealed character. A carefully worded note from a distant relative might hint at opportunity or threat. A letter from a business partner could suggest loyalty or barely concealed impatience. And the millionaire, accustomed to reading meaning between lines, often spent more time contemplating subtext than literal content. The art of interpretation was as crucial as the art of wealth. While some evenings were contemplative, others were devoted to minor indulgences, a collection of foreign curiosities, small treasures accumulated during travels or purchased from distant colonies. Objects of porcelain, bronze, or rare wood were examined under lamplight, appreciated for craftsmanship, origin, or simply for their ability to impress visitors, even if those visitors were never present at that moment. Possession itself was pleasure. Control over the object's care, display, and interpretation added a layer of satisfaction that wealth alone could not provide. Music, often reserved for more public occasions, sometimes made a quiet appearance in these private hours. A piano played softly, or a music box was wound to create gentle melodies. Unlike daytime performances, there was no audience to judge. Still, the millionaire derived satisfaction from maintaining refinement in solitude. Music became a companion, an extension of mood, a subtle affirmation that even private time could be orchestrated beautifully. Even fashion had a role, even in the quiet of night. Clothes were changed into nightgowns, dressing robes, slippers, yet even these choices were deliberate. The fabric, the cut, the comfort, all mattered. Victorian millionaires knew that ease and elegance were not mutually exclusive. Their attire, even in private, reflected a constant negotiation between comfort, aesthetics, and self-perception. Nothing was left entirely to chance. Nighttime also allowed for more introspective contemplation, particularly on legacy and mortality. While wealth insulated them from immediate hardships, it did not protect them from the awareness of impermanence. The mansion, the gardens, the staff, the possessions, all of it existed under temporary stewardship. Thoughts of inheritance, succession, and the proper placement of assets often hovered like shadows in the corners of the room. Victorian millionaires, acutely aware of their place in a lineage, understood that wealth was both privilege and responsibility, and the night amplified this duality. For some, the nocturnal hours were also a time for strategic planning. Business ventures, investments, political alignments, all could be quietly reviewed while the world slept. It was in these hours that a millionaire might chart the course for the next day, sending brief, discreet instructions to trusted confidants or annotating ledgers with a meticulous hand. The night was not idle, it was preparatory, contemplative, and quietly powerful. Yet, there were moments when the wealthiest allowed themselves a touch of whimsy. A chance glance out a window might reveal fog curling over rooftops, gas lamps flickering, the occasional figure crossing a street, unaware of the enormity of life happening in the house behind them. In those moments, a millionaire could imagine stories, indulge in small fantasies, or simply enjoy the quiet satisfaction of being both observer and participant in a world shaped by their influence. Occasionally, visits occurred during the night. Long-awaited letters from distant colonies, urgent business communications, or unexpected guests. These were handled with discreet efficiency, servants ready, rooms illuminated selectively, and interactions conducted with the same measured calm that had governed every day. The ability to manage interruption gracefully was as important as any investment, for social or financial disruption could ripple outward quickly if mishandled. Even personal reflection included careful evaluation of moral and social standing. Victorian millionaires were deeply conscious of appearances, propriety, and societal judgment. Evening solitude provided the space to consider whether their actions that day aligned with expected decorum, charity appropriately distributed, interactions conducted with civility, influence exerted subtly. Such reflection was not mere self-congratulation, it was rehearsal for tomorrow's stage. Finally, the night ended with preparation for sleep. Rooms were darkened, fires banked to a gentle glow, curtains drawn with care. Bedchambers were arranged meticulously, pillows plumped, sheets turned, and the final touch applied to ensure comfort without sacrificing order. The millionaire lay down, often with lingering thoughts of the day's subtle successes or minor missteps. Even sleep was framed as a transition, a necessary pause before the cycle of wealth, influence, and social performance began anew. And so, in the stillness of the night, Victorian millionaires found a rare equilibrium. The house quiet, the city outside softened by darkness and fog, they were able to rest in comfort, reflection, and the gentle satisfaction of having navigated the complexities of wealth with skill, elegance, and careful strategy. It was a time of quiet power, a space to reconcile privilege with responsibility, and a pause before the world demanded attention once more. In this way, night was not merely the end of a day, it was a private rehearsal for the perpetual performance that defined life at the top in Victorian society. It was an intricate blend of reflection, planning, indulgence, and ritual that ensured wealth remained not just a possession, but a carefully maintained identity, visible to the world even in absence. Leisure, escapes, and luxuries. Mourning in a Victorian millionaire's household had a quiet dignity that suggested both routine and ritual. Unlike the hurried, often chaotic awakenings of the city below, the wealthy awoke in a world that had been meticulously prepared for their comfort the night before. Curtains were drawn just enough to allow soft light in, fires glowed faintly to ward off the chill, and the faint scent of polished wood mingled with hints of morning tea. The transition from night to day was not abrupt. It was orchestrated, subtle, almost ceremonial, reflecting the larger principle that defined a life of immense wealth, control over every element of existence. The millionaire would rise from their four-poster bed, perhaps stretching luxuriously, feeling the weight of both comfort and expectation. The bedclothes were heavy and warm, yet carefully arranged so that their removal required little effort. Servants, already alert to the schedule, moved silently in the background. Their presence was invisible yet essential, a demonstration of wealth not through flaunting, but through seamless orchestration. The day began in quiet efficiency. Dressing was a measured affair. Even in private, clothing mattered. Morning robes were chosen for warmth, elegance, and ease of movement. Shoes, slippers, gloves, and accessories were laid out with precision. The millionaire had to project the appearance of effortless competence, even before stepping outside or seeing a single visitor. Here, as always, discipline was a key companion. Luxury demanded it. There was no room for sloppiness, even in solitude. Breakfast was another carefully staged ritual. Meals were often modest in quantity, but impeccable in presentation. Tea or coffee served in fine china, toast lightly buttered, perhaps a small pastry or fruit arranged for both taste and aesthetics. The act of eating was performed slowly, deliberately, as though every bite affirmed refinement, self-control, and the careful management of appetite. Victorian millionaires understood that indulgence without composure was a social failing, even in private. Mourning also brought attention to correspondence. Letters received overnight were examined with deliberate care. Some required immediate responses, others were filed for strategic consideration. This was an exercise not only in information management, but also in power. Each message contained potential influence, gossip, or opportunity. Even routine correspondence became a subtle exercise in strategy, reinforcing the millionaire's role as a figure who commanded both attention and obedience. Once breakfast concluded, the day's activities began in earnest. Estate management was a priority. A walk through the gardens or grounds allowed inspection of work done, supervision of servants, and private reflection. In the gardens, one could note the growth of plants, the precise angles of trimmed hedges, and the order maintained over natural chaos. Wealth was not merely an abstract concept. It was visible in the meticulous arrangement of living things, a tangible assertion of control over both nature and domestic life. The millionaire might also attend to investments, reviewing ledgers, speaking with financial managers, or corresponding with business partners in the colonies. Even in a world dominated by social appearances, economic mastery was the foundation of all status. Without it, the facade of elegance and leisure would crumble. Victorian millionaires recognized that wealth required not only accumulation, but maintenance, vigilance, and careful orchestration of opportunity. By mid-morning, social obligations began to assert themselves. Visits, meetings, or calls from acquaintances demanded the same precision and attention previously reserved for correspondence and estate management. A millionaire's day was a series of interactions, each layered with subtle expectation, politeness, discretion, and a demonstration of taste and refinement. Even in casual conversation, there was a quiet competition, a battle of wit, influence, and perception, fought entirely without overt aggression. Meanwhile, women of the household navigated a parallel labyrinth of social expectation. They attended to the morning's rituals of hair, dress, and accessories with an almost sacred precision, each gesture affirming their competence, beauty, and social intelligence. Letters, invitations, and reports from charitable committees required attention. Plans for social calls, afternoon teas, and visits to fashionable boutiques had to be carefully integrated into the day's schedule. Every movement, every choice was part of a continuous ballet of impression management. For both men and women, the mid-morning hours were also a time of subtle preparation for public appearance. While the city continued its noisy rhythm of commerce and labor, the millionaire's world existed in a quieter, more deliberate plane. Posture, speech, dress, and timing were all considered. The rich recognized that visibility was an obligation. To be seen was to assert position, influence, and taste. Absence, unless strategically planned, was an omission that could undermine reputation. Even private studies and libraries became spaces of performance in miniature. Selecting a book, adjusting a document, or handling a piece of correspondence was done with deliberate elegance. Reading was not always about content. It was about signaling intellect, curiosity, and cultural refinement. Every action was observed, if not by actual eyes, then by the ever-present awareness of social expectation. A millionaire's mind rarely rested. Even in solitude, it rehearsed, observed, and evaluated. Afternoons often transitioned into lighter activities designed to balance leisure with social strategy. A walk in the garden, a carriage ride through nearby streets, or a visit to a gallery or museum allowed both relaxation and visibility. Observing the outside world while maintaining the air of detachment was an essential skill. One had to appear relaxed, interested, and effortlessly elegant, all while assessing acquaintances, rivals, and opportunities in subtle, unspoken ways. For women, visiting shops or boutiques served a similar dual purpose. The choice of fabrics, millinery, or accessories conveyed taste, awareness of trends, and social connections. Even a casual conversation with a shop assistant could be layered with intention, politeness, authority, subtle critique, or affirmation of expertise. These daily routines were not mere indulgence. They were exercises in influence, refinement, and self-presentation. By late morning, the millionaire's day often reached a state of quiet, productive rhythm. Tasks were managed, correspondence reviewed, guests acknowledged or scheduled, and private reflection allowed. Yet, even at this stage, the pressures of wealth remained. A sense of vigilance persisted, a subtle awareness that status, influence, and social position were sustained by constant attention. In Victorian society, fortune was never entirely secure. It required perpetual cultivation, awareness, and care. And yet, in these carefully orchestrated hours, the millionaire found a kind of satisfaction. The home, the estate, the personal routine, and the subtle influence over others' perceptions created a sense of order in a world that was otherwise noisy, unpredictable, and often harsh. Wealth, carefully managed and properly displayed, provided a buffer against chaos. A controlled sphere where one could navigate life with confidence, elegance, and relative ease. As the morning concluded, preparations for the afternoon were quietly initiated. Calls to confirm visits, instructions for estate staff, or reminders to servants to ready rooms and attire. The day was continuous, a chain of carefully linked actions, each reinforcing the other, each maintaining the grand illusion of effortless command. Victorian millionaires lived within this rhythm, a blend of ritual, performance, and subtle control, each element a testament to the painstaking art of wealth in a society that judged as harshly for absence as it did for presence. And so the morning ended, gently giving way to the afternoon hours, when leisure, visibility, and strategic social interactions would occupy the remainder of the day. The cycle was precise, predictable, and immersive, a world where wealth demanded constant attention, yet provided the comfort of order, ritual, and the subtle pleasures of refined existence. Aging with wealth in the Victorian era. Afternoons in the life of a Victorian millionaire were not simply a passage of time. They were a carefully curated continuation of a day that demanded equal measures of attention, strategy, and elegance. By this point, the morning's routines, dress, correspondence, estate management, and minor indulgences, had established a rhythm that guided the remainder of the day. Yet the afternoon brought a shift in focus, a transition from private ritual to semi-public performance, where visibility, refinement, and social influence became subtly intertwined. The garden, once a private sanctuary in the morning, now took on the dual role of leisure and display. Carriages might arrive at the gates, signaling the approach of guests, acquaintances, or distant relatives. The millionaire would move through this space with practiced ease, every gesture a demonstration of calm mastery. Paths were swept, fountains glimmered in sunlight, and hedges cast perfect shadows across gravel walkways, as though the landscape itself had been trained to reflect order and authority. To stroll through the grounds was to remind oneself, and any observer, that wealth was not merely measured in coins, but in the ability to shape the world according to one's vision. For women of the household, the afternoon was a strategic time. Visits, calls, and excursions required precise timing and elegant execution. A trip to a boutique was never merely about purchasing goods. It was a performance, a demonstration of taste, discernment, and social awareness. Milliners and dressmakers were observed as much as they observed, and the selection of fabrics, colors, and accessories was subtly scrutinized by peers, creating an ongoing cycle of evaluation and impression. Even the manner in which one handled the shop assistant, folded a gown, or lingered over a hat could influence social standing, reinforcing the idea that wealth was inseparable from perception. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, men of the household often engaged in their own forms of subtle performance. The study, library, or gallery provided spaces for controlled observation, strategic planning, and reflection. Ledgers were reviewed, letters read, and accounts reconciled with deliberate care. These activities were framed in a manner that suggested intellect and gravitas rather than mere administrative necessity. Victorian millionaires were acutely aware that their status depended not only on accumulation, but on the continual demonstration of competence, taste, and discretion. Tea, of course, marked a transitional moment in the afternoon. The ritual itself was as precise as any formal gathering. Cups were filled, spoons polished, and small cakes or sandwiches arranged with care. Conversation was gentle yet deliberate, carefully balanced between the mundane and the revealing. Each word, each pause, each gesture contributed to a subtle interplay of social dynamics. Even the act of sipping tea was executed with awareness. Too hurried a movement could suggest impatience. Too languid a sip, indifference. This was a society in which every motion, no matter how trivial, carried weight. Some afternoons were devoted to controlled excursions. Carriage rides offered both visibility and leisure. Passing through the city, the millionaire might observe acquaintances, gauge reactions, and subtly reinforce their presence. Visibility was a key instrument of influence. It was not enough to possess wealth in private. One had to be seen in its exercise, a living demonstration of status. These rides were slow and deliberate, allowing for assessment and reflection, blending relaxation with performance. Charitable commitments often filled the remainder of the afternoon. Victorian society expected those with means to demonstrate moral and social responsibility. Committee meetings, fundraisers, and lectures were not merely philanthropic. They were carefully staged acts of public image management. Attendance, engagement, and even minor contributions were noted, ensuring that the millionaire's reputation as both benevolent and influential remained intact. These acts were performed with grace, avoiding any hint of arrogance while subtly reinforcing social position. For women, charitable activities offered similar opportunities. Organizing donations, attending committee meetings, and managing household contributions to local causes allowed them to demonstrate refinement, social awareness, and competence. Even minor errors or oversights could ripple through social circles, so precision and tact were critical. These engagements provided avenues to assert influence, foster alliances, and maintain visibility without overt display. Even in these structured activities, private reflection remained essential. Gardens, libraries, and quiet corridors offered spaces to consider investments, relationships, and future plans. The afternoon provided a temporal buffer, enough activity to maintain public presence, yet sufficient solitude for contemplation. Decisions made during these hours could ripple through social and economic networks, affecting not only personal reputation, but the fortunes of allies and rivals alike. As the afternoon progressed, preparations for evening events began subtly. Invitations were confirmed, staff instructed, and attire inspected. Even the smallest details, placement of silverware, polishing of glassware, arrangement of floral displays, were coordinated to ensure seamless execution. The millionaire understood that the success of an evening rested on careful preparation during the afternoon. Invisibility of effort was paramount. Any misstep could undermine the impression of effortless elegance that defined high society. Social visits, once brief and formal, became opportunities for extended interaction. The drawing room offered a controlled setting where conversations could unfold with precision, where subtle cues were exchanged, and where influence could be exerted without aggression. The wealthy navigated these moments with practiced skill, balancing friendliness with discretion, amusement with measured gravity. Every smile, nod, or remark contributed to the ongoing orchestration of reputation. Art, literature, and music also played a role in afternoon engagement. Reading aloud, playing instruments, or examining collections offered subtle demonstrations of cultural literacy. These acts were not purely personal, they reinforced social status, signaling refinement, taste, and intelligence. Victorian millionaires understood that culture, like wealth, could be wielded as a form of subtle authority, shaping perception without overt assertion. Afternoon transitions into evening were marked by a gradual softening of activity. The pace slowed, the light shifted, and the household moved toward the evening's rituals. Yet, even in these hours, awareness remained keen. The day's earlier engagements informed the next stage. Decisions were recalibrated, and social strategies refined. Life at the top required constant attentiveness. Rest, though necessary, was always provisional. By the close of afternoon, the millionaire had achieved a delicate balance. Tasks were managed, appearances maintained, and social obligations met with grace. The garden, the carriage, the drawing room, and the study had all contributed to a tapestry of influence, visibility, and cultivated control. Every movement, every gesture had reinforced wealth not just as property, but as a carefully curated lifestyle, visible in both public and private spheres. And yet, beneath the surface of elegance and composure, there remained the quiet hum of vigilance. The millionaire's mind, though temporarily eased by routine, remained attuned to the shifting currents of society, commerce, and reputation. In these moments, the layered structure of wealth revealed itself, a blend of comfort, ritual, influence, and subtle performance, each element dependent on the other, each requiring constant attention. Thus, the afternoon concluded, a bridge between morning labor and evening display. It was a time of balance, reflection, and preparation, a liminal space where the wealthy navigated both solitude and society, leisure and duty, control and anticipation. In Victorian times, a millionaire's afternoon was never idle. It was a deliberate, measured performance, a carefully managed extension of life itself, blending practicality with display, contemplation with social mastery, and comfort with perpetual expectation. Legacy, memory, and the Victorian dream of immortality. Evening settled over the city like a silken fog, curling through streets, alleys, and the faint chimneys of London. For the Victorian millionaire, this final act of the day was both culmination and prelude, a moment where all carefully cultivated appearances, social obligations, and private indulgences converged into a subtle, deliberate performance. The house was illuminated softly, fires glowing in drawing rooms and studies, lanterns flickering in corridors, and the faint golden light spilling into gardens where shadows danced like sentinels. Here, the millionaire would navigate the final stage of daily life, the evening itself, its rituals, and the private reflections that accompanied them. Visitors were already arriving. Carriages pulled to the door, footmen moving silently to announce their presence. Guests were received with the same polished charm and effortless poise that had been rehearsed through decades of social expectation. Smiles were calibrated, gestures precise, conversation carefully balanced between warmth and subtle authority. Each interaction reinforced a single truth. The millionaire's presence mattered, influence was maintained, and status was visible, even if only to those who truly noticed. Dinner, when it arrived, was more than nourishment, it was theater. The table was laid with precision, silver polished to a reflective sheen, porcelain arranged with geometric elegance, glassware gleaming like small captured stars. Candles were lit, their soft flicker casting shadows that softened the edges of the room, making even the stiffest posture appear natural. Guests were guided through courses with grace, conversation orchestrated to display intelligence, taste, and refinement without appearing deliberate. In this world, mastery of the small, subtle details was the hallmark of a life spent at the top. Throughout the meal, the millionaire observed quietly, listening to the ebb and flow of conversation, noting who impressed, who hesitated, who spoke too much or too little. Even compliments were measured, lavish enough to be gracious, restrained enough to retain authority. The rhythm of the evening was choreographed in miniature, a microcosm of social control, a demonstration of wealth in both tangible and intangible forms. Wealth was not merely counted in coins, estates, or land. It was expressed in the ability to orchestrate moments, to command attention while appearing effortless. After dinner, the evening continued with music, games, or the occasional performance. A string quartet, piano, or harp provided gentle, atmospheric sound, creating a soft backdrop for conversation and reflection. Music was never merely entertainment. It was a tool, shaping mood, signaling taste, and reinforcing the quiet dominance of the host. Even laughter and applause were calibrated, polite but restrained, preserving dignity while allowing enjoyment. Victorian millionaires understood the importance of controlling not just the material aspects of wealth, but the emotional atmosphere of their surroundings. For women, the evening offered further opportunities to demonstrate refinement, influence, and social intelligence. Conversation, small gestures, and the careful handling of social rituals, the offering of tea, the arrangement of cushions, the subtle attention to each guest reinforced their competence and status. Even the act of movement through the room was performed with awareness. Posture, pace, and grace were observed and subtly evaluated by those who mattered. In Victorian society, mastery of social nuance was as vital as financial acumen. Private moments within the evening were also important. A millionaire might retreat briefly to a study or library, reviewing correspondence, planning future engagements, or simply reflecting on the day's interactions. The mind, though fatigued, remained active, assessing influence, weighing alliances, and considering subtle adjustments for tomorrow's performance. Even in leisure, vigilance was a companion. Wealth demanded constant attention, and even minor oversights could ripple outward with unexpected consequences. The house itself became a quiet participant in these rituals. Fires glowed softly, carpets muffled footsteps, and lamps illuminated spaces with gentle, flattering light. The architecture, furnishings, and decor, all curated over years, reinforced the impression of order, control, and timeless elegance. Each detail, from the polished banister to the placement of a vase, was a statement of authority and taste. The millionaire's environment was a living testament to wealth, carefully maintained and subtly expressive, both to visitors and to the self. As the evening drew on, guests departed gracefully, each farewell a carefully measured gesture. Compliments were exchanged, invitations extended or implied, and the social hierarchy reaffirmed through subtle observation. The millionaire remained, standing quietly in a hallway or seated by a fire, aware of the rhythms of power and perception that governed every aspect of life. Even absence was meaningful. Leaving a guest behind too long could disrupt balance, while orchestrating departure demonstrated skill and authority. Once the house had grown quiet, the millionaire finally allowed themselves more private reflection. They might wander through dimly lit corridors, glance at family portraits, or inspect objects collected from far-off lands. These artifacts, curiosities, small treasures, and inherited heirlooms, were reminders of both personal taste and the broader social network that sustained wealth. Each object was a reflection of influence, history, and careful curation, silently reinforcing the illusion that control was absolute. In the final hours before sleep, attention turned inward. Thoughts of legacy, family, and the continuation of social and financial influence surfaced naturally. Wealth, for all its power, was temporary. Possessions could pass, influence could wane, and status could falter. Victorian millionaires were acutely aware of the fragility beneath the surface of their carefully maintained lives. Private reflection in these hours allowed both acknowledgement of this fragility and reassurance through ritual, order, and contemplation. Preparation for bed was itself a ritual. Garments changed, slippers adjusted, and the four-poster bed made ready. Fires were banked, lamps extinguished or dimmed, and curtains drawn with care. The room, like every other space in the house, reflected control, elegance, and deliberate planning. Even as they lay down, the millionaire remained alert, aware of the cycle that would recommence at dawn. Sleep was not abandonment, but a transition, a pause before the next day's performance, reflection, and management of both fortune and reputation. Yet, despite this vigilance, there was comfort in these final moments. The house, estate, and city beyond provided a sense of security and continuity. The millionaire could rest in the knowledge that, for the moment, all was in place. The household functioning, the garden pristine, social obligations met, and reputation preserved. These hours were a rare equilibrium, where wealth, influence, and control intersected in silence, allowing temporary surrender to the quiet rhythm of night. And so, as eyelids closed and the mansion settled into complete stillness, the Victorian millionaire could drift into sleep, carrying the subtle satisfaction of a day conducted with precision, elegance, and influence. Wealth, carefully curated and maintained, had provided not merely comfort, but mastery, a life orchestrated in meticulous detail, visible both to the world and in private reflection. This was the essence of being a millionaire in Victorian times, a blend of luxury, ritual, control, and subtle performance, carried through dawn to dusk and finally to the quiet sanctuary of night. For the wealthy, life was never accidental. Every gesture, every choice, every interaction reinforced identity, authority, and the perception of effortless command. And in the final silence of night, the millionaire could at last rest, confident that for another day they had maintained the delicate, intricate balance that defined their existence at the very top of society.